Hi, Richard Rambarran, here again, an economist and finance specialist by training, and I'm here at Ignite News for Budget in Focus 2026. I have here now the almost Herculean task of trying to break down Dr. Singh's almost 7 hours of budget speech to you here and bring to you some of the key aspects of what the Minister of Finance would have discussed or presented in the National Assembly just a short while ago. So some of the key things to pay attention to. Firstly, is the size of the budget. The budget actually grew from 1.38 trillion in 2025 to 1.588 trillion in 2026. The question remains, what does that mean for you? And after speaking for an extended period of time, how does that information translate into something tangible for you as a Guyanese citizen? So the first thing I believe that one would need to understand about a national budget is actually what it is, how is it comprised, and in what segments are the relevant pieces of information contained. So in the first component of it, the budget outlines the performance of the economy in the preceding year, in this case, 2025. And that really is the first big chunk of what was presented. The second element of it really had to do with what government intends to do in 2026. That is to say, an outline of its program of work. What are the major areas that the government wants to touch on? And subsequent to that, there's a short presentation on the same aspects of the economy that would have been reported on for 2025, but this time forecasts for 2026. So think about all of that as being the second big component. The third big component of the budget, which is really the part that a lot of people tune in for, because those are the key measures that really impact on people's lives. So in this instance, we have perhaps about 31 measures that were presented in the National Assembly. But before we jump into that, I want to just bring your attention to some of the major indices that would have been reported on for 2025. Let's get into it. So the very first is that for 2025, the growth rate of the economy, which is the rate at which the economy expanded by, was somewhere around 19.3%. Of course, these are still averages, and the Ministry of Finance, as time goes on, will give the final numbers as they release the estimates, so approximately 19.3%. Non-oil growth, which is a very critical number in modern-day Guyana, because it refers to everything within the economy that is happening without oil. So non-oil growth or non-oil expansion in the economy actually landed at circa 14.3%, which, as you can imagine, is a significant number in terms of growth. Generally, economists tend to view anything around 4% growth as being something that is healthy. So you can imagine an economy which oil is such a readily talked about commodity growing at 14.3% in 2025. That is a number to certainly hold on to. In 2025, we saw an expansion, healthy expansions of all sectors of the economy, which certainly is something that is impressive for any economy around the world, particularly economy that is coming from a base like Guyana's. So in the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors, we saw an 11.5% growth rate. Mining and quarrying, 21%. Manufacturing, 20%. The electricity sector grew 5.3%. Construction and services 31%, and 8% respectively. These, by any measure, are strong growth numbers and represent quite a lot of confidence that exists in the economy, and really the economy bearing fruit of years of sound macroeconomic policy, an environment that is existing from an economic standpoint that facilitates and is conducive to private sector growth. There have been some key metrics also reported in the economy for 2025 in the budget speech I want to draw your attention to. Firstly is the fact that private sector credit grew by 18.5%, almost 20% increase in the amount of credit being provided to the private sector. As you can imagine, this represents a very strong development for the private sector. And it's concentrated actually in the agriculture sector, the mining sector, and the services sector. So that really demonstrates that these sectors are not just performing well, but people continue to borrow to invest into the sectors, which, by all accounts, shows that these sectors are pretty healthy. Another very important metric reported for 2025 was that of non-performing loans, which means all of the bad debts that exist in the economy. Now, in years bygone, we would have seen this number being in the double digits, 12%, 10%, coming down all the way to 8%. But it is to the credit of sound decisions, sound macroeconomic policy, good private sector investment, and confidence in the economy that this number is practically almost at zero, 1.6% for non-performing loans. Inflation remains low at 2.5%, another very big ticket item that we know is talked about quite often. Inflation, of course, referring to rising prices or the rate at which prices rise in the economy. But when inflation is observed more carefully, as Dr. Singh would have reported, it's primarily driven by food inflation or increases in food prices. So that is a reality which, of course, we need to continue to pay attention to. As we progress along, there were a few other very important points which were made. And one of them is the fact of unemployment. Now, unemployment in Guyana for some time has been reported to be at a higher than expected rate, but it's a fantastic pleasure to hear that in this budget, it was reported that unemployment has actually dipped below 7%, down to 6.8% for general unemployment in the economy. Youth unemployment, which is a metric that we have to pay attention to, has actually halved, 12.1% in 2025. So these are some of the key metrics that were reported on for 2025. Now, as it relates to some of the major forecasts for 2026, because those are important, in the very same vein that the sectors were reported, forecasts for 2026 also are very strong and promising. I'll touch on some of the key ones, some of the big ticket items. One, in the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors, 7.6% anticipated growth. In mining and quarrying, 17.6% anticipated growth for 2026. Manufacturing, 12.9%. Construction, anticipated to grow in the upcoming year by 25.4%, and services by 6.8%. Overall, the economy is anticipated to grow by 16.2% in 2026, and non-oil growth strong once again, 10.8% forecasted for 2026. And inflation targeting, which of course is what the government is attempting to set the inflation level to through management of the economy, is actually targeted to be 2.5%. Once again, attempting to contain cost of living, contain inflation, and ensure that disposable income is available to you all. Now, I know we would have had quite a lot to digest over the time, so I'll attempt now to compress those 31 measures, pretty complex measures, but also very pertinent to each and every Guyanese. So in the first instance, we see promoting productive activity being the broad umbrella under which it's reported. So I'll just touch on some of the very key ones. Agriculture and agro-processing. We see the removal of corporate tax on agriculture and agro-processing, which really is in line with the continued drive by the government of Guyana, led by His Excellency Dr. Irfaan on emphasizing the importance of agriculture and emphasizing the importance of agro-processing as we continue to diversify Guyana's economy. Secondly, we see the removal of VAT on locally made furniture as well as locally made jewelry. This, of course, does wonders for supporting artisanal production, supporting industries that are burgeoning industries in Guyana, and continue to require the support of government by pulling levers to ensure that they are more competitive. Recall in our preview, we would have spoken about attempting to build an internationalized and internationally competitive private sector. We see these measures here as creating the preconditions under which such a building can happen. Another very important measure in promoting productive activity is that of the removal of duty and VAT on security equipment. I think there is no question that public security is extremely important, and as Guyana continues along its growth trajectory, we'll find that many persons, enterprises, and even government institutions will want to ensure that their data is secured, cyber secured, physically secured, and the removal of duty and VAT on security equipment does exactly this. A massive announcement that has been made under this segment of promoting productive activity has been the establishment and the capitalization of an SME development bank. We heard Dr. Singh mention $100 million to seed finance or to start up or operationalize this SME development bank, where zero interest, zero collateral loans will be provided for microcredit in targeted sectors up to approximately 3 million Guyana dollars. And then he discussed about a co-investment model where government will come on board and help to shoulder some of the risk and perhaps provide up to approximately 7 million Guyana dollars. A number of other measures around home ownership too were discussed, including but not limited to increasing the low-income mortgage ceiling from $20 million to $30 million. This, of course, has very strong implications at the commercial banks, new building society, and for individuals who are seeking to build their homes within this threshold. It's now moved from $20 million to $30 million by which you can access these lower interest rate products. Extending the low-income mortgage ceiling windows to insurance companies is also extremely important, because when you obtain the home, obviously you have to be able to secure the home by way of insurance. And so that represents another seemingly simple but very impactful measure in the lives of Guyanese. And the continuation of this home improvement subsidy that has been implemented recently that, of course, brings tremendous relief, but also directly and materially impacts on an individual's ability to translate simple land into the actual establishment of a home. And of course, the holding of that asset is something which certainly helps with intergenerational wealth, and it helps to increase the asset base which an individual can have. One understands that in Guyana, to have a strong asset base such as real estate is something which will permit you to be able to access broader finance, be able to have commercial banks support you, and of course be able to lend credence to any credit facility which you may be seeking. Now, measures to contain cost of living, another very interesting segment and very pertinent to all Guyanese. Firstly, continuing the zero excise tax on fuel, which is at its core maintaining the current regime, is something which cannot be understated. Though fuel prices around the world are no longer at their massive highs that they were in 2022, 2023, the government continues to retain zero excise tax on fuel. What that does effectively is to ensure that any price increase does not pass through to consumers at the pump. And in actual fact, we can continue to enjoy these wonderful rates that we are seeing at the pumps here in Guyana. That, at its core, really helps to contain cost of living. Because if you think about it, fuel is actually an input into a number of productive processes and into transportation, which impacts everyone's lives. Another very important measure which was highlighted in the budget as it relates to containing cost of living, so another big area we're discussing, containing cost of living, is the reduction in freight charges, which, of course, the calculation of import tax on pre-pandemic levels of freight is extremely important. And ensuring that that quantity or quantum of charge is kept is important in ensuring that the cost of living is contained. And I found a measure which Dr. Singh presented in that segment to also be extremely useful and something which all Guyanese should view as being not only fiscally responsible, but I would say giving the government space to be attentive to the prevailing needs of Guyanese. That is 9 billion Guyana dollars being set aside for the responsiveness to cost of living and cost of living challenges which we may have. I especially was pleased that the supporting the vulnerable bracket, which is another big component of what we would have seen being presented. So we see an extension of the Because We Care cash grant, not only increasing from 50,000 to 60,000 per child, but now we also see a transportation support grant being provided of 20,000 per child, and a uniform allowance, of course, of 5,000, which means effectively children, each child, whether in private school, public school, they're all receiving approximately $85,000 support, which, as many persons know, that can go a very long way for households in Guyana. Continued support for CXC, 8 C-sex subjects. That is another measure which shows care for human capital development and really ensuring that the theme of the budget about putting people first is at the forefront of the government's agenda. the extension of old age pension by almost 20%, the increase of it by almost 20%, public assistance increasing, old age pensioners also getting a transportation grant of $20,000 per annum. And then once again collaborating with the private sector in removing corporate taxes on any child care facility or elderly care facility which may be established under the ambit of the private sector. And where would I be without touching on one of the very topical issues? That is the reclassification and reorganizing of duties, taxes, and levies on vehicles. I know all Guyanese were anticipating this very much, and His Excellency the President would have given some insight into this at his address to Parliament. And so some of these would have been announced before, but they were reiterated in the budget speech, and some new ones added also. Firstly, the reduction in the double cab pickups, now a 2,000cc flat tax of $2 million being applied on 2,000cc vehicles. For 2,000cc to 2,500cc, a flat tax of $3 million. And then removal of VAT on new vehicles below 1,500cc, less than 4 years old. Hybrid vehicles also, removal of VAT for those vehicles below 2,000 cc's. I think this really represents a step into another era in vehicle ownership in Guyana, moving away from punitive regimes and really having an impact on people's pockets for ownership of vehicles. I think this represents a step strongly in the right direction. And there are two other very important aspects of the removals that happened, which I think will impact greatly on folks who live in the hinterland communities especially. Firstly is the removal of all import duties on any all-terrain vehicle, and then also the elimination of taxes and duties for engines up to 150 horsepower outboard engines. And for those who have been involved in these communities, visited these communities, they would know, of course, that this is a measure which will bring massive relief. So these represent substantially a major aspect of the budget. There's one final element which I want to touch on, and that is how does all of this and how does this entire architecture of the budget feed into the disposable income. And so one of the very last bits of the budget that was presented is on increasing disposable income. So Guyanese, of course, have gotten their cash grants formalized, 100,000 Guyana dollars, that was announced. We would have discussed some of that in the preview. We also see the removal of net property tax completely from Guyana for anyone who owns a property and for those who are venturing into home ownership by way of the government's programs. They would know the impact of property tax. But importantly is the income tax threshold being moved from 130,000 Guyana dollars per month up to 140,000 Guyana dollars per month, which directly has an impact on 5,000 Guyanese citizens, removing them from the income tax net, and therefore adding almost $2 billion in disposable income. Overall, $100 billion in disposable income being injected into the economy by way of budget 2026. It is an expansive program of work that has been presented by the government of Guyana. Of course, we can do no full justice to the extent of what Dr. Singh would have presented. And over the next few days, you'll see various analyses coming out, and some of it at times may seem intimidating. But as I wrap up, I want you to just simply remember what a budget is. It's a program of work by government that highlights what the government wants to do and divided into three main parts. I'll just recap. The 2025 performance, or the performance of the previous year, what the government intends to do in the upcoming year, and what those forecasts are for the big sectors, and then what measures is the government going to be doing. So as you digest the budget over the next few days or few weeks, bear those in mind, that what may appear to be an extremely large, voluminous, and complex document is essentially broken down into those three main parts. And I just gave you some of the key aspects that you ought to concern yourself with and familiarize yourself with as it relates to Budget 2026, putting people first. This is Richard Rambarran, economist and finance specialist, here on Ignite News, or Budget in Focus 2026. Thank you for joining me.